The year is 2020. The whole world has come to a halt. It's COVID. You're a young scientist in Ghana. What can you do to advance our agenda in terms of how we actually protect ourselves? Well, how about sequencing the COVID genome? How about after sequencing the COVID genome, you take all of that scientific know-how, all of your experience, and start a business that is actually cataloging the genome DNA structure across the African continent to bring medical advances to the continent, particularly in cancer cure. It's science, it's medicine, it's healthcare, it's real enterprise. Join us as I have this conversation with Dr. Yaw Bediako. What would it take to really create a prosperous Africa where every African has the opportunity to thrive and not just survive through life? That's what we talk about at the Bold New Normal podcast. We talk to leaders about their areas of endeavor, the work that they're doing to bring the Bold New Normal to life within their sphere of influence, their staying power, and the fact that they serve as an example of what is possible. Join us. Dr. Yaw Bediako, thank you for joining us on the Bold New Normal podcast. I am so excited to have this conversation with you, and I hope we have enough time to unpack all that is Dr. Yaw Bediako. But first of all, tell everyone who you are.
Thanks, Lucy. It's great to be here. So my name is Yaw Bediako. I'm an immunologist by training with a PhD from Northwestern. I am a researcher and life scientist. I've been doing research pretty much since my freshman year in undergraduate. And over the last 5 years, I'm also an entrepreneur. I co-founded and I'm CEO of Yemaachi Biotech, which is a life science research company headquartered in Accra with a growing Pan-African footprint. And then most recently, I have also additionally taken on a role as Dean for Research and Innovation at Ashesi University in Brekusu here in Ghana.
Congratulations on all your amazing work and your more recent appointment to Ashesi. I have known you a number of years. I forget which year exactly, but it was definitely a pre-COVID year many, many years ago. So I'm truly excited about today's conversation because I've kind of sat on the sidelines and seen how you progress very intentionally, step by step. So in addition to people taking away the context of your entrepreneurial work and so on, I'd love people to also take away a bit about that journey and what it really takes to achieve some of the things that you have been able to achieve. Now, before we dive in, who is an immunologist?
An immunologist is a scientist who is interested in the immune system, quite simply. So the immune system is the part of our body that protects us against disease. And as the name would suggest, an immunologist is somebody who studies that and tries to understand it, usually with regard to trying to develop vaccines, which obviously during COVID became quite famous. But then also increasingly, immunologists are involved in developing what we call immunotherapies, which are ways that we try to enhance what the immune system can do, especially against diseases like cancer. So many of the new treatments for cancer are called immunotherapies, and so would involve a good amount of immunology.
Okay, awesome. So if I fast forward from when I first met you, fast forward to 2020, and I recall 2020, for anyone who was under a rock, was the year COVID hit the world. And at that time, you were working at Noguchi, right?
I was actually working at WACBIP, volunteered at. So I did do some work at Noguchi during COVID because Noguchi was a national testing center. So a bunch of us at the university volunteered.
Okay. So I'm still unpacking this particular conversation for all the geeks like me who are really interested. What is WACBIP? Because sometimes in Ghana, we don't fully aware of all the scientific and STEM related work that actually does go on the ground. So what's WACBIP and what is Noguchi?
Sure. So both WACBIP and Noguchi are within the University of Ghana. Noguchi is over 30-year-old institute. It is probably Ghana's #1 medical research institute, named after Dr. Noguchi, who was a Japanese researcher who worked in Ghana. And so it has strong links to the people of Japan, and they have provided a lot of support. WACBIP is I think now 11-year-old center that was founded by Professor Gordon Awandare and is affiliated with the Biochemistry, Cell and Molecular Biology Department of the University of Ghana. It's a standalone center and primarily, as the name suggests, historically has focused on cell biology of infectious pathogens. So WACBIP stands for the West African Center for Cell Biology of Infectious Pathogens. Because it's such a mouthful, everybody just says WACBIP. And so it's in some ways, you can think of it as a scaled down version of Noguchi with a very specific interest in training. So WACBIP runs master's, PhD programs, has successfully graduated well over 300 masters and PhDs over the last 10 years. And in fact, many of the trainees from Noguchi actually get their PhDs through WACBIP. So there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship between Noguchi and WACBIP. So during COVID, we all worked together to try to contribute to help with the COVID response. So while a lot of the testing activity was concentrated at Noguchi and other places, WACBIP focused heavily on the research. So we wanted to understand what is going on with the virus and how can we understand it better and hopefully control it better. And a key way to do that is to sequence. So you're exactly right. Sequencing the genome of an organism basically means decoding its DNA. And when you do that, you can understand its features, you can predict some of its behavior, and importantly, you can hopefully then begin to develop solutions to protect people against it. And so we did a lot of work at WACBIP. We did surveys, thousands of people trying to understand who had antibodies, so who would potentially be protected. But a key part, and everybody now became interested in variants, right? The idea of a variant of a virus really comes down to sequencing it. So you can only tell which variant, whether it's Omicron or Alpha or Delta. Those names were derived from sequencing the virus. And so it was very important that in Ghana, we didn't just depend on knowledge from Europe or America. We needed to sequence the COVID that was here, because the COVID that was here was not necessarily always the COVID that was somewhere else. I mean, COVID kept evolving. And so at WACBIP, we sort of led the first efforts to sequence. So the first 15 samples in Ghana that were sequenced were actually sequenced at WACBIP. And actually, I should say, it wasn't sequenced by me, it was sequenced by a female scientist who leads the genomic sequencing lab at WACBIP. So a woman sequenced the COVID virus for all of Ghana. And that's when President Akufo-Addo made the announcement and said, we have sequenced and these are the variants. All of that information came directly from the research at WACBIP. And so we had a regular report that we sent to the Ghana Health Service, which then informed the fellow Ghanaian speeches that we all listened to during the COVID time.
Awesome. Awesome. I just love it. I had to unpack that story because it's a great sense of pride for many young people sit back and they always think that if I want to do something that's deeply scientific, I can't do it in Ghana. And I know not everyone wants to do the research that WACBIP does, but I know there are other people doing other forms of research. And it's so important that we share that information with people. Now I want to talk about your at the time baby. Now it's growing not much of a baby any longer, growing very quickly. You founded Yemaachi in 2020. First of all, do tell us what Yemaachi means, but also what specific gap in global oncology research were you trying to close?
Sure. Maybe I can take a step back to sort of set the stage. So I trained in the US. I then did postdocs in Kenya and then in the UK. So by 2018, 2019, I had finished my PhD in 2012 and I'd done 6 years of postdoctoral research, both in Kenya and in the UK. And when I came back, 2019, I joined WACBIP as faculty right before really COVID struck. And at the time, I was very focused on an academic career. I was very focused in, I had now a faculty position at the University of Ghana, and my focus was very much on training the next generation of African scientists. And as you said, there's a lot more capacity now than there was 10 years ago. And we have good PhD programs. So there's a certain amount of capacity that is built. However, what began to frustrate me pre-COVID and post-COVID was that nearly all the money that funds our research is external. So I just talked about Noguchi. It's named after Japanese scientists, and most of their funding comes from Japan, in addition to grants received from the US and from Europe. WACBIP is no different. WACBIP was set up through a loan from the World Bank, which was underwritten by the Ghana government. However, nearly all of WACBIP is entirely grant funded. There is no, WACBIP exists because Prof. Wandari and other researchers are able to secure grant funding. So all the research at WACBIP is funded externally, most of it from the NIH, from the UK government, from the Wellcome Trust, from the Gates Foundation, and the list goes on and on. But the common denominator is probably 99% of that money is external. And so I began to ask how sustainable that is, right? And we found out how unsustainable it is during COVID, and we found out even more lately with the current US leadership and the demise of USAID. In fact, even before then, during COVID, the UK government significantly cut overseas development assistance. And that meant a grant that I was supposed to receive from the Royal Academy was cut. So I got a letter saying, congratulations, after 9 months of selection, you've been selected, but unfortunately, we have no money anymore to fund the grant. So that is the context within which many African scientists find themselves. It's not unique to Ghana. Nearly any African scientist working in Africa is under similar constraints. South Africa does a little bit better. They have some national funding. And of course, Ghana has now launched a national research fund, but that was just launched this year and it's yet to really offer any grants. So that is the context within which I returned to Ghana. COVID created a little bit of a bubble. There was lots of interest. There was lots of money towards COVID testing. But once COVID began to get under control, we went back to status quo. And I was not satisfied by that. And so I asked myself, how do we create more sustainable support? Yes, our governments in Africa need to contribute more to research. Currently, they do less than 0.5% of GDP to research, even though I think it's now 17 years ago, they made a resolution to do 1%. Very few countries have got anywhere near. The US is 2.5%, and so on. So, and the global average is, I think, 1.5. So nearly every African country is way below the global average for investment in R&D. If you just wait for your government to do something, you might wait for a really long time. And admittedly, our governments have a lot of competing demands on limited resources. They need to build roads, they need to build schools, they need to build hospitals. Research always tends to fall down that list of priorities, partly because it's not politically attractive. If you have a 4-year term, you build a school, you get votes. You go and give 10 million to researchers to do research, you may get criticized because the results of research take longer to present themselves. And most people will say, why didn't you spend that money building a school or a road or a hospital? So I felt that it had to be another reason, another way to generate money. And if you look at Europe, look at North America, actual fact, 75% of that 2.5% of GDP invested in R&D is actually from the private sector. It's not government money. So in actual fact, the US government does not spend 2.5% of GDP on research. It spends 25% of that. So 75% of that 2.5% of GDP is actually from the private sector. And so it made me realize that we're actually asking our governments to do something that even the US is not able to do. But what we were missing was the business side. We're missing industry. Because Africa admittedly has hardly any biotech industry. Our pharmaceutical manufacturing is very at the end, sort of manufacture without R&D. So we depend on R&D done elsewhere. And so we have very little of an industry. And so I asked myself the question of, if we don't have industry in science, who is going to build that industry? It has to be scientists. And so even though I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur up to that point, I kind of got frustrated enough to throw myself into entrepreneurship, to say, you know what, I'm a scientist. I'm pretty competent at science. I've done that for I've done that for, over a decade at different levels of my training, but now I need to do it in a slightly different way. And so that began the journey of Yemaachi, of starting a biotech company. So initially I began with, I want to start a biotech company. I didn't really know what the biotech company would do. But so I began to ask myself, if I want to have a biotech company, what kinds of areas should we begin to focus on? And in that process, I began to get a lot of advice, importantly from non-scientists. So I reached out people like you, actually, and people like Bright Simmons, and a whole list of people who had demonstrated courage, had demonstrated, excellence and intelligence in areas, and in particular had taken on business and were building successful enterprises. And through that discussion, that process, Yemaachi began to take more and more shape. The decision to focus on oncology was both a personal one and a strategic one. I lost my father to liver cancer several years ago, and I felt, as I did more research, I realized how big of a problem cancer was in our part of the world. But additionally, cancer is not just an African problem. And for Yemaachi to succeed, I felt it was important that we did more than serve the Ghanaian or African market. We needed to look global. And so cancer provided that opportunity. That if we could build a business in Africa studying cancer among Africans, it would still be meaningful to people in Europe and North America, where currently a lot of the money resides. And so by doing that, we could build a business that sat at the intersection between Africa's needs and the world's wants, and that would potentially serve as a good model. So that is how the thought process gradually evolved from, I really want to start a business, but I don't know what it's going to do, to, okay, I want to start a cancer-related business. And then gradually, more and more, iterations. And, 5 years later, we are where we are. Yemaachi, the name itself reflects where I was. I was working at WAGBIP. My office mate, Dr. Prof. Lucas Menga-Etego, is from the north of Ghana. And I didn't really want a tree-dominated name. That's from my father's side. I'm from Agonising. I speak tree. But I found that most companies in Ghana had tree names. And I just thought Ghana is more diverse than just the South. And so just in chatting with him, asked for a few ideas for words. And so in the end, Yemaachi is three languages. It's Frafra, Ewe, and Tree. So Yem means knowledge. Machi in Ewe means medicine. And Machi in Tree obviously is good morning. And so new dawn for health knowledge in Africa, Yemaachi, somehow reflecting a little bit more of the diversity that is in Ghana.
I love it. I love it. I love it. And this brings me to why we're having this conversation today, because over the years, the bold new normal has evolved to a point where we're very clear in terms of what we need to achieve to create the Africa where everyone prospers. We believe that healthcare is at the heart of that, but I use the word heart already, but our acronym is HEART. It starts with healthcare because we need to be healthy, right? And alive. We need good education to really inform our minds and really make the most of our talents. We need agriculture so that we can be fed and actually produce some of the medicines through agriculture as well that we need. We need a real enterprise. We need businesses that can really build corporations and build companies that can employ people. And we need trade across borders, because we need to trade across, at least across our continent, if not across the world, to really create prosperity. What strikes me very clearly in your story so far is that, yes, you have a very clear focus on healthcare, oncology research. You have a very clear focus on being entrepreneurial. So you're building a real enterprise. And I know your business, it's 5.5 years old, but it's very impressive, already grown. But you're also thinking beyond borders already, right? In terms of the populations that you serve and the partnerships that you raise. So even though I will keep doubling down on the healthcare part, I really feel that you occupying this position, even without mentioning your work at Ashesi, just in Yemaachi, you're already straddling so many aspects of what will make us more prosperous as a continent. You mentioned talking to people, and I think it's another point I want to reiterate, because many people feel as though just because I have an idea, I'm the only one to prosecute that idea and bring it to life and make something of it. But whether it's even with me, the bold new normal, I have people who bring their ideas, their thinking, we strategize, they challenge me, they agree, disagree. So I think that's very important for people to hear that from someone like you, who's so highly educated and technical in your knowledge. You still found the space to add more knowledge to that. So thank you for unpacking that for us. So let's talk a little bit around, systems and the realities of the work that you're doing on the ground. You did mention that African populations are underrepresented in global genomic data sets, right? So you're solving for that. What are the scientific and commercial consequences of our exclusion?
So, yeah, you're exactly right. If you look at genomes globally, and genomes basically is the data from our DNA. So if we sequence the COVID genome, that's the COVID's DNA. In our case, the human genome helps us to understand who we are and how we are susceptible to a variety of diseases. The human genome was first sequenced in the early 2000s.
I remember.
So it's been over 20 years. Unfortunately, most of the people we've sequenced in that time have been European. So currently, less than 3% of all genomes ever sequenced are Black. Most of that 2 point something percent are African American, who themselves are an admixed population. So if you actually come to the continent of Africa, less than 1% of the genomes that exist have come from people living on the continent of Africa. And that is a That is a significant underrepresentation, considering the continent of Africa accounts for 17% of the world's population, 24% of the world's disease burden. And importantly, the African continent is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet. Evolutionarily, Homo sapiens, which is our species, evolved from Africa. And we've spent, over 200,000 years just in Africa as a species before a few adventurous individuals decided to try to migrate further afield. So in evolutionary terms, human populations in Europe, North America, Asia, Latin America have been there relatively recently. They came from Africa. And so you can think of it as a big pot of M&M, multicolored candy. And you can imagine every possible color is in Africa. And then when people migrate, they take their DNA. So the colors represent the genetic diversity of the DNA. When a few people migrate, they take their DNA with them, but they don't take their neighbors with them, right? So everywhere else, Europe, North America, Asia, represents a subset. So a few colors moved, and then when they had children, they expanded, but that means their children reflect them. So Europe, Latin America, Asia are much less diverse genetically than Africa is. And you can pretty much find everything in Europe. You can find it in Africa and everywhere else, and all the other places similarly. So Africa represents people call it the cradle of life and all of these. It literally represents our genetic ancestry as a species, not just as African people. So when you asked about the scientific consequences, by excluding Africa from genomic activity, it's actually an own goal on the human race, right? We are hurting ourselves because our understanding as a species, whether you're European, you're Asian, your understanding of a species starts with understanding what happened in Africa. And so in an age of precision medicine, where we're trying to make better medicines that are more targeted to a disease, we need more diverse data. And so science is beginning to realize what mistake they've made. And so people are now beginning to think, how can we get more data from African people? But in that process, we need to make sure it's not just another commodity that Africa has that is taken out. Africa has a history of exploitation, our gold, our cocoa. Ghana, we export beans and we import chocolate. Thankfully, now we're making pretty nice chocolate here, but it hasn't always been the case. And most of our best cocoa goes. Kenya, their best tea goes. That is the model from colonial times. In order to ensure that our genes are not treated like cocoa or tea, we need industry in Africa that is capable of generating this data, analyzing this data, and then partnering with research around the world. So that is why we set up our company the way we have. Partnership is key to scientific advancement. You don't just work in a silo. However, you need to ensure that there are benefits and there is value that also comes back to the people, in this case, whose genetic information you are working with. Now, that only happens if you add value locally. And what I mean by that is if I collect people's samples and I ship it to Europe and America and they do the sequencing, it's equivalent to taking a raw cocoa bean and exporting it. However, if I sequence it here, now I've added value. I can then share that genome with partners. But then that genome continues to live on. I can share it with another partner and a third partner. All of a sudden, that single sample has now become data that I can leverage in multiple ways. And as I continue to build my capacity, I can move away from just sharing that data to sharing knowledge I have generated from that data. And importantly, knowledge I can patent. That is how R&D works. Anybody who has an iPhone will look on the box and it says designed in California but made in China. iPhone is an American brand. Nearly all the revenue from iPhones resides in America because America owns the intellectual property. And so that's what we are trying to do. And I think it's a model that we need to expand across Africa, whether it's in agriculture or other areas of research. We need to move from knowledge consumption to knowledge production, because if you produce the knowledge, you own the knowledge. And then when you share it and somebody else finds something cool based on that, they pay you a royalty. So then you are benefiting from that activity. And I think if we can do that, then Africa is not only a partner in global discovery, but is also benefiting from the commercial side of that discovery. And then that is that has huge potential for economic transformation on our continent. So that's I think the both scientific and commercial ramifications of our exclusion, but also has now created a huge opportunity, because our exclusion is now creating an opportunity where there's a demand for data in Africa, but we have to be smart about it. If we just ship samples because we want some quick dollars, we actually are giving away effectively our birthright, and it's something that we need to work very hard to add value to in order to partner in a more equitable way.
Honestly, listening to you gave me goosebumps, and I'm trying to calmly listen step by step, because anyone who's listening, whether they're a scientist or not, that model that you describe of our propensity to give away too soon, too cheaply, costs us and keeps us poor, and hands the power over to the people who add the value and really, create the intellectual property, whether it's our raw material. You're right. But even when I had the opportunity to work in football, that's how I felt we treated our footballers. Even our footballers, like, how do we produce so many great footballers for other nations and countries, and yet we can't have enough to even win globally? So I
Yeah.
digress slightly, but it's a similar kind of analogy. And I use that football point to say, anyone who's listening to you, even if they're not a scientist, think about the breakdown that Yaw was just given to really show the thought process. So, and I'm going to have to force myself to keep this streamlined, because I can think about so many different ways to go with this conversation. So allow me just one small digression in terms of, you have shown great leadership in doing this. One of the points at which I got goosebumps listening to you is when you talked about the sequencing of the genome, and I tied it back to your COVID story of sequencing and how everything adds up and builds up. But what I want to ask you more directly on that leadership point is your mindset. What do you think has informed your ways and your perspectives? Because for instance, I touched on the fact that you're, as we say in Ghana, a learned person. So, but you still allowed yourself to learn more in a different field. You still had bold ambition about what a company like this can potentially do. You could have said, I'm just solving something small in Ghana, but you looked at a global challenge and were willing to start from zero, rather than saying, actually, I don't know anybody like me who has tried to solve this problem. So I don't know why I should be solving this problem. Let me go and find something. Well, let me even just leave Ghana. That would be the easier place, and go and join some research center. So tell us a bit about, what do you think has influenced your mindset? If you can describe your mindset, fine. But what has influenced you to really take this approach and perspective?
Well, I think I credit my parents, and hearing you speak and reading some of your writings, I think you also credit your dad a lot with who you are and how he brought you up. And I think the same applies to me. Both my parents are academics, both my parents, professors. My father had 2 PhDs. He was not afraid to take on big challenges. And I saw that growing up. I mean, to get 1 PhD and then change fields and then go and get a second one, because that's what you need to do. I mean, that takes a special kind of person. But I think beyond that, my dad modeled what I call African excellence. We hear a lot about African excellence these days, but it's typically not grounded on true excellence. It's bravado and it's just talk. And it tries to tug at our Afrocentrism without really critically asking ourselves, is this truly excellent? And I think that's something that, I try to encourage young Africans to do is, yes, I'm all about African excellence, but it has to be excellent. Just because it's African, you cannot plaster over it. And so my dad was extremely rigorous in his academic work, extremely courageous. He himself established an institute, the Akufi Cristala Institute, which was the first private institute to get a charter to offer degrees in Ghana. They did it before Ashesi, before many of these places that came along. And he was committed to Ghana. He had opportunities to, he had offers from Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Oxford all the time. And I saw him repeatedly turn them down because he was committed to building his brand here. Not for himself, but because he would say Africa doesn't lack good people, but Africa lacks good leadership. And leadership starts with yourself, right? And
Yes.
so I grew up in that environment, both my younger brother and I. And I think I credit a lot of who I am today with seeing the sacrifices both my parents made to build something excellent here, to confront the narrative that Africa is somehow substandard. And so everything I try to do is to confront that narrative. But the way we confront it is not by complaining and asking for handouts or asking for equity. I mean, equity is important. Equality, yes, we ask for it. But the world doesn't work that way. People don't just give it to you. And so I everything I do is sort of driven almost, maybe it's a level of insanity, I don't know, but I'm completely driven by the need to show that Africa is not somehow inferior to anybody else. But I want to do that. I don't want to be given that. I want to take it, right? I want to be the best. And then people have no choice, whether they are racist, whether they are bigoted, whatever it is, they have no choice but to say, well, the best they can say is, well, maybe he's not like the rest. We saw that with President Obama, right? Oh, yeah, he's just whatever. If there are enough of us, eventually they can't just say that anymore. So, but I think that is that's really my father. And as I said, I lost him to liver cancer several years ago, and I've been driven by a need to, in my own small way, contribute to that kind of legacy. So I think that is an important part of who I am. It makes me more excited by difficult problems. Like you said, Yemaachi, we could have picked something small, but you don't change the world that way. Not also that I'm so self-confident that I can change, but even in my small sector, if I can be excellent at what I do, I feel like it'll set off a chain reaction. And really, that's what I hope Yemaachi is. The vision for Yemaachi is, yes, we want to become a unicorn. We want to become the big biotech company in Africa if we can. But more importantly, I want young people, younger than me, to see our example and say, you know what, we can do this. Because as I've been going through building Yemaachi and engaging with people, one of the things I've realized is for many African people, our gaze is too low. And it's not
Yes.
because we lack imagination or we lack ideas. It's because we allow the limitations of the environment, we allow the pressures of life, we allow what everybody tells us about Africa to
Yes.
color our ambition. And so then we set achievable goals. You don't,
I like the quotes on achievable.
yeah, you don't hit the moon by saying, oh, let's just, think about what Elon Musk has done in making a recyclable rocket, right? Now, I'm not a rocket scientist. I don't quite know all the physics that goes into it. But the idea that somebody would say, let's make a rocket that goes up and then we land it, that takes imagination, and it takes almost, you don't look at what's achievable now. You try to dream of what's achievable tomorrow. And I don't think we do that enough in Africa. And I think we need more people to do that, to say, yes, right now we don't have this, we don't have that, we don't have that. But tomorrow we could have even much more. Right. And so that really has driven me and continues to drive what we do. And I try to impart that to my team. I should say that I've also learned that I need to know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I'm very learned perhaps in certain areas, but I'm a novice in many other areas. And so even with Yemaachi, my co-founding team, and even, the group of people, around that are all people who have expertise I didn't have or I don't have. And so by bringing them on, I was filling in my own areas of where I lacked some capacity. And I've tried to learn from them as well. And I think that's a key part of building something, is that recognizing what you don't know and not seeing that as a weakness, actually recognizing it as a strength, that when I can identify and self-identify what I don't know, then I can do something about it. And then getting the right people to fill in those areas where you perhaps don't have the same capacity, and then build together. But yeah, I think what drives me is taking on big challenges. And I guess I view the Ashesi role now as an additional challenge. Not finished building Yemaachi, now you're trying to do something else. But
I
that's
know,
what,
right?
it keeps me going, because I think we need more people to do that. We need people to see that
Yes,
Africa can do anything.
exactly.
And so some of us have to just go the extra mile to try to kickstart that process. And I like to call it organizing as opposed to agonizing. We can all see the problems of Africa, but a few of us need to begin to organize and do something about it, and portray a vision for Africa that is much more ambitious, and I believe will ultimately be successful.
I love it. You in there, you're talking about boldly challenging what is our norm, really are setting clearer, ambitious visions of what we will do, not letting our environment dictate what we think is possible, but think beyond. And because even that person sitting in that mature market that you think they've got everything made for them, they're thinking about the next big thing that they want to achieve that doesn't exist. And so just by what you're doing, you're really demonstrating that it is possible right here in Africa. And I love what you talked about in terms of bringing other people with knowledge in, because a lot of the time, as far as I have learned in my journey, and it sounds like it's the same for you, you have to have the humility to recognize your gaps, right? It takes a degree of humility to say, yeah, I don't know this thing. Fine. Who knows this thing? Is it the kind of person I can work with, I can partner with? They bring what they know, I bring what I know, and we build together. And this is a core part, because a lot of the time we find people who want to be the Lord and Master of everything that is in front of them. And that's it. If I'm not Lord and Master, we won't do it. So you talk about ambition and boldness, but biotech is huge. I mean, in terms of capital intensivity, so how much money you have to put into it, in terms of how long it takes to actually get the results, which we know will come. I know you have some results now, but in terms of overall, think about a research-based business. You do have to play a long game.
Yeah.
So let me play the cynical Ghanaian or African cloud. How realistic is it to build a globally competitive biotech firm from Ghana without state backing? You heard all my emphatic words.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, you have to be half crazy. And I fully think I am. But that's, crazy today is somebody who's called an innovator or, prescient in later on. Time will judge us by that. The great minds of today are the madmen of yesterday. It's a matter of perspective. But you also have to recognize the challenge. So I think the key, there are certain people who have tried and have failed, I think, because they didn't respect the problem enough. So it's not about bravado and just papering over how difficult it is. I'll absolutely agree with anybody who says biotech in Africa is a long shot. No doubt. There are significant structural challenges we have to overcome. But as I said before, those challenges also create opportunities. And if you have the discipline and the guts and the stick with itness, right? The willingness to just grind, success can come. But success comes, it takes time and it comes at a cost. I mean, when you met me, I wasn't great. As you can see, I'm
great guys now.
So it's extremely difficult. What we are doing at Yemaachi and in general, like you said, biotech is hard. It is very capital intensive. There's very little money. Africa gets a very small slice of venture capital anyway. And very little of it, if any, is currently earmarked for biotech. The fund, the length of funds in Africa, usually 10 years, they want to see returns in 5. That doesn't fit with the biotech model at all. There are no comps. There are very few comps to point to, right? So whereas fintech and agtech, there are a few success stories. Biotech is yet, although I will say the biggest exit from Africa is actually a biotech. It's InstaDeep, Tunisian computational bio company bought by BioNTech for almost $700 million. That was the biggest exit.
Wow.
Yes, it happened 2 or 3 years ago. The biggest exit Africa has seen, bigger than Paystack, right? However, it was a biotech company. And I think that's what biotech represents for me. It is high risk, but really high reward. The ceiling for biotech in Africa is way bigger than payments. It's way bigger than fintech. The reason being, most fintech solutions are going to be Africa focused, which is fine. So you can have Wave, really successful, fantastic, but it's African payments. It's not taking on Stripe, right? It's not taking on the American juggernaut. It may get acquired by Stripe Monday, but biotech, the world is your market, right? And so if we can, right, all of a sudden we transcend the identity of an African equivalent of this, right? You're not the African equivalent of some American company. You're just yourself. But it takes time. So you have to be willing to work hard. You have to be willing to be flexible. And I mean, admittedly, you need the grace of God and a little bit of providence. I mean, we are still here, but by no shot of the imagination has it been easy, and nor is it a cakewalk from here. You're constantly to find money to keep going. You're constantly having to navigate difficult regulatory and sort of capital environments. So you have to be adaptive. And so it's extremely difficult. But I can also see our growth. In 5 years, we have way further than I thought we would be. It's just that I realized we have even farther to go. So on the one hand, it's not, we're further than I thought we would be, but at the same time, it's much harder than I thought it would be, right? But that also means, but it's also worthwhile. So I think biotech, I may be biased, but I really think biotech sector in Africa of any sector I have seen, because biotech also translates to agriculture, technology, and so on. I think with health and food, those two critical needs globally, biotech has the potential to transform African economies better, I think, more than our minerals sort of sector or any other sector. I think what Singapore has done on a small scale as a country of, island, city, nation of 4 million people, if Africa could do, we could take on the world. So I think biotech the sector for Africa. I think it takes advantage of a lot of natural advantages we have, whether it's diseases, whether it's genomic diversity, whether it's biodiversity. We have all of it here. We have a young population. We could do what India did, but then do it in a slightly different way. And there's a huge opportunity for biotech to really transform Africa. But we need to find a way to get the investment. And that is the challenge, is how do we attract adequate investment? Because you can't really do it from your garage for very long. Biotech is one of those where you have to have enough capital. And I think that's the bottleneck we face. But hopefully when a few of us gradually break through, investors want to make money. And once they see a few examples of how they could make money, I think the door will blow wide open. But for now, a few of us have no choice but to succeed. And hopefully pave the way for those coming behind us. But it's difficult, and it's not for everyone at this stage, but we're still here, and I wouldn't be doing anything else. I really think this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm excited about what the next few years have for us.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. And as you were speaking there, I was thinking about some of the enabling factors when it comes to biotech. So if we think specifically around intellectual property, do you think we have intellectual property as an enabler in shaping Africa's role in the global drug development or ownership or collaboration ecosystem? Or do you think that there's more that can be done around intellectual property management, handling to I wouldn't say, when I use the word favor, I don't mean unfair favorability, but more of a level playing field.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I think like you said early on, we give away a lot for nothing. And that is because a lot of our research is still concentrated in academia, where the metrics for success are typically publication, degrees, and oftentimes, because the funding is from external parties, the agreements are structured in such a way that we get some benefits, but I will call them short-term benefits. Most of the long happen outside. But that is also, it's not just, we can't just blame it all on those funding us. It's also a lack of initiative from our end. If you are happy being a co-investigator, always being a co-investigator on someone else's project, you're not doing enough work. If they cook up the whole project, they do all the hard work. The hardest part of a project is not finding the money. The hardest part of the project is coming up with a really innovative idea. And so if somebody in Europe or America does that hard work and then invites you to join their study, that's fine. But if you look at your career and it's always that you are invited in, then you have to ask yourself, are you really pushing hard enough? We need enough people who would do it the other way, where you come up with the idea and then you invite them in. When you do that, you set the terms of engagement immediately. You are the leader, they are supporting you. And many people are happy to work in that. It also means, though, that as the leader, you need to secure the resources from wherever you can find them. So you need to do more work. But if we do that, then we own more of the process. And I think that is where industry also comes in. We need enough of an African industry that when industrial commercial players in the West are looking for partners in Africa, they go business to business. Because that is the way you then get more and more equity. You cannot expect a professor, an academic institution, to negotiate with a hard-nosed commercial lawyer on the other side. You're always going to lose. We need businesses in Africa to engage with businesses in the West to then strike up more useful relationships. So when universities in Africa, the model I would propose is university in Africa work with local industry. And then when you're ready to go global, you do it via the African industry. That way it's business to business and they ensure they get good terms for them, but also for you. And if we can grow that industry, then our biotech industry becomes the bridge. And so a lot more of that innovation that starts in our universities will see a commercial future, as opposed to direct to the West, where most of the time, very early work is done here. It's not protectable because it's not enough to be IP. Then it's continued for a few years overseas. Then the IP is generated, and then the commercial success entirely goes to the overseas partner. So it's not that anybody is taking advantage necessarily of us. I don't think there's like bad. I mean, there are a few bad actors, I'm sure, but it's mostly just we don't recognize how to generate more leverage, and we need to be smarter about how we engage. But I think that will come. But yes, I think we need to think more about intellectual property. We need to educate ourselves better, and ultimately get more sophisticated, I think, in how we conduct business and how we think about overseas funding. I think many people are just happy to get support. They don't ask themselves what strings are attached. And should I say yes, grant, or should I say no, it's a bad deal? Because sometimes when you say it's a bad deal, they come back with a better one. But if you don't say it's a bad deal and accept it the first time, they'll take it. It's like bargaining in the market. So that sophistication and that confidence that if I say no based on good grounds, I back myself to find a better deal down the line. I'm not going to just take any deal because I'm desperate. And I think we need to begin to build the enabling environment where our scientists are not desperate and therefore are not forced to take bad deals.
I like what you say because essentially you've got to know what you're worth. The reason why you're able to say a deal is bad is that you know what you are worth and whether this is in your interest. I think the other thing you pointed out there was this idea that getting outside support can take you off the course of what you were actually trying to achieve because you've had to make concessions. um, like the fact that you emphasize the need for us to add enough value to our ideas so that they're protectable, right? Because I started the question about intellectual property. Well, what is intellectual property that needs to be protected? It has to have a certain intrinsic value that means that what comes out of it should be protected because what comes out of it is valuable. So that's, I could, again, I think about so many things that we have done or contributed to the world, but we contributed at such an early stage that it doesn't come back to even speak to. And I go back to the simple example of cocoa. Um, the world knows Belgian chocolate and this chocolate. And these are countries that don't grow cocoa.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
But the intellectual property of chocolate is not ours.
Yeah, it's the chocolatier who just mixes it together and makes a tiny little thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Chocolate, Belgian chocolate, and it's a thing. Whereas, I know that somewhere in Asia, people are selling a brand called Ghana chocolate, and I don't even think we can protect it. I don't think we've protected it. And everyone says it's the best chocolate because it has our name on it. But how do you get to call your chocolate after our country with no recourse to us? An analogy, an example. I know I've simplified it, but how can you do that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like English
Yeah.
breakfast tea. Not a single tea plant has ever grown in England, right? It's from Asia and
Right.
Africa. And yet somehow tea is the beverage. I mean, it is the intellectual property and the structures that have been created to support that industry. And so we need to build our own industry to say we will add value locally. We will, and we will take on that extra task because it's not easy. It's you have to go the extra step and it can be hard. But I think backing ourselves to do that. And I think that's where maybe governments can come in. I know, like I said in the beginning, our governments are cash strapped and they have many things that they need to try to do. Excuse me. But there are certain things they can do to protect African industries, create certain moats, make us more competitive, whether it is through tariff reductions on imports, whether it is through certain requirements for external parties who want to work in Africa. Whatever be the case, governments can create create certain barriers to entry that give local industries an opportunity. We're seeing that a bit with rice and spaghetti and those imports, but I feel we need a much more sophisticated discourse about how we create competitive advantages locally for ourselves that then position us to get a fair shake going forward. Yeah, I think so. I exactly right. But I think it begins at the innovator. It begins create the value, be willing to create the value, create the chocolate, do the hard part.
Yes, do the hard part.
You have the product, then get someone to help you to protect your position in the market. Go and get trained and make the chocolate. Don't just be satisfied to farm the bean. And I think we need enough people here who want to make chocolate.
I love that. And as you're talking, I'm thinking now in my mind, pivoting a bit to your role as the Dean of Research and Innovation at Ashesi, because I was listening to you thinking, gosh, some people get to learn from you on a regular basis through this other role, which is brilliant. So when you think about your role as CEO of Yemaachi, you think about your role as a Dean of Research and Innovation of Ashesi. I think about it simplistically and go, wow, a student gets to learn from you, not just your intellectual academic journey, but your entrepreneurial journey. And when I think about heart in the bold new normal, we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about research, we've talked about real enterprise, we've talked about some of the trade beyond borders because you're thinking globally, but now you're also in this space of education. So I will only need you to add agriculture, and then you covered everything that we need, and then you become the playbook and we're done. So let's pivot to education.
Yeah.
Where do you see these roles that you play, this double hatting career reinforce each other, and where do you see any potential points of conflict between the two roles?
So I mean, I've had to answer questions from my investors, right? Obviously, let me just be quite clear. When the news hit, some of my investors were like, "Isn't that a bit of distraction? How are you going to balance?" The reason I took the role at Ashesi goes back to what I said before, that some of us have to push to stretch ourselves because the ecosystem, for Yemaachi to succeed, Yemaachi needs to reside within an ecosystem. And that ecosystem spans human capital development all the way through product development to commercialization, basically your heart's sort of rubric. With Yemaachi, I'm trying to work on the product development stage, the value addition. But in order to do that, I need good talent that can enter the workforce. And importantly, I need other companies to spring up around us. We can't be an island. It's very difficult to grow as a business when you're the only one doing everything. And so with the role at Ashesi, I saw an opportunity to begin to try to influence how we think about training the workforce for what I hope will be Africa's biotech revolution. And it's not just about good technical skill. It's about leadership. It's about entrepreneurship. It's about the mindset. As I talked about the gaze, how do I get young people to not think about what they can do now, but dream about what they can do tomorrow? And I saw the opportunity at a school like Ashesi, which is itself an incredibly inspiring journey from, I think almost 25 years, from a house in Laboni to a 100-acre campus in Brekusu. With an endowment that would make, quite frankly, many US colleges jealous. All of that built on the foundation of ethical leadership, equipping young Africans to transform Africa. That's what Patrick Pewua, the founder and president of Ashesi, has set out to do. He moved back from America and said, how do I train young people to transform Africa into the Africa that I dream is possible? So that aligns with me. That's what I'm trying to do. And in someone like Patrick, I have a mentor who I can look up to. So once again, I'm thinking partly about myself in that I'm trying to build Yemaachi, but at Yemaachi, I'm the CEO. Yeah, I have an advisory board, but I need mentorship. Who better to mentor me? Already I have Professor Wandari as one mentor in the academic sphere. But now I have somebody who has built a university as if it was a startup. Look at Ashesi. Ashesi is a company, right? It's an educational company. And that level of discipline, fiscal discipline, ability to fundraise, and clarity of vision is something that I admire. And I felt this would give me an opportunity to sort of learn how to do that. But the value I could bring to Ashesi was I am building a company and trying to transform Africa in my little corner exactly the way Patrick hopes his students at Ashesi will do one day. And so I am, not to be cocky about it, but I am an example of what he hopes these young people will do. And so by
Yes.
being able to come back, I can hopefully bridge that gap between academics and entrepreneurship and transformation. And in so doing, try to create more of an ecosystem. So that's what, my role at Ashesi is a non-academic role. It's a strategic role to try to think of how we create a research environment at Ashesi. The desire is to build Ashesi into an R2 university in less than 10 years. R2 means
And what's R2?
R2. So Carnegie has these classifications. You have R1, R2, and RCU. RCU is basically a bucket for all universities who are doing a little bit of research. R2 means you're graduating 20 PhDs every year across departments, and you're investing $5 million, minimum of $5 million every year purely on research activity. Right. Now, that is extremely ambitious. But that is the task that has been set by leadership at Ashesi, that they want Ashesi to move into an R2 status within less than 10 years. That would mean in 30 years, 35 years, from zero house in Laboni to an R2. And my job is to try to think about how we can get there. It's, once again, big challenge. Woo, let's go. But R2, a university like Ashesi being R2, will be producing the kinds of people that I would like to employ at Yemaachi, and also the kinds of people that would create other Yemaachis. And so how can I contribute to make that happen quickly? How can I contribute a little bit to see that vision? So that's what attracted me to the role, is it directly aligns with what I believe my company needs for its own survival and success. But more importantly, it aligns with the broader vision we have for our continent, where we link human capital creation and talent with employment, and not just any employment, but rewarding self-actualized employment. Because when I hear people talk about capacity building, all too often we focus only on training. So we need more PhDs. Everybody says, oh, Africa needs 1,000 more PhDs. No, we don't actually. We have them. They're just outside of Africa. And if we keep doing what we're doing, we'll spend more money to train them locally, but they'll still leave because they don't have jobs that attract them. And so it would make the brain drain just much more expensive. So we need to tackle job creation. And we're doing a bit with TVET and things like that. But, there you're, creating technical artisanal jobs. Yeah, that's good for a sector of our population, but we need high level, high paying, really rewarding technocrat jobs as well, where you have software engineers, you have scientists, you have non-vocational roles that also are very attractive. And I think that only comes when you build a private sector that can absorb them. So my hope is that the role at Ashesi allows me to begin to influence that journey in Ghana, but hopefully more broadly, where we can link our training of young people with employment opportunities that these young people actually really want. And vice versa, we are training people that these companies need. That way, we help both sides of the coin, and we gradually build a much more self-sustainable ecosystem.
There's so much to unpack in what you said there. You're right. The brain drain becomes self-fulfilling, because if you keep training them and there's nowhere for them to go and no work for them to do, then they have to go somewhere to do the work, and then they leave, and then you train more, and then you just you're just pouring water into a basket, and it just keeps seeping out. It's great to train our people. It's great for them to have impacts globally, but we also need them to work on the ground. You talked about yourself, you talked about Patrick, we could name so many other people. And typically my setting is positive possibility all the time. Positive, positive, positive. But as I listen to to yourself, allow me a question that's not always about the optimistic, but also the sort of maybe a bit of unpacking a bit of the negative. Why do you think we don't have more Yaos and Patricks and other people? What's our reason?
I think I think we can't underestimate the damage that has been done. Let's not even talk about slavery. Let's talk about colonialism. The educational system in the colonial and post-colonial era created people, bureaucrats, and people who would administer administration, but not people who would challenge. That's not, it was a very strategic move by by the British in our case to create people who were good at pushing paper, but would not question why we were pushing the paper. And so I think we continue to suffer a bit from that style of education where we were not creating innovators, we were creating people who were good at using other people's technology. And I think it takes people who have had some exposure to something else. I mean, I have been fortunate and very blessed to have the exposure that I've had in my life. And I think, like I said, starting with my parents who themselves, my father had opportunities actually paid for by the Ghana government to go abroad very early. So my dad finished his first degree at Legon. He was a brilliant scholar, full scholarship by the Ghana government in those days to go to France to get a PhD, to come back and teach in Legon. Then he got that PhD and then decided he wanted to do something else. So he managed to get them to release him from his bond. But that he had been exposed, and then he was able to pass that on to his children. And so I fully acknowledge that I've had a certain amount of privilege in the exposure I've had. And I think that has helped me to view Ghana from the eyes of a very proud, patriotic Ghanaian, but one who has also seen what the rest of the world does and how they do it, and some of the things they do better than us, but also some of the things we do better than them, but we don't always realize we have, right? So it's sort of on both sides. And I've been blessed with, I guess, being encouraged as a young child into my adulthood to voice my opinion, not to keep quiet when I see something. And I see people like Patrick, people like Prof. Wandare, people like yourself. That's a common thread. It's like you speak up, and that's not very cultural for us, right? So you don't challenge authority. So I think we are paying for a lot of different things. Partly our cultural deference to seniority and elders sometimes is a good thing in certain times, but can hold us back. Also, our educational system that has historically really been about regurgitating facts, not really interrogating what those facts mean and why we are learning them. So all of that comes together to create a bit of a system where you don't have enough people who are willing to push the envelope. Thankfully, that is beginning to change. There are a lot of young people who want to start something new. I think what they lack now is, as I talked about, the excellence, the foundation. They're eager, they have enthusiasm, but how good are they technically in their field? And sometimes they haven't taken the time to mature and they are over eager. But I'm encouraged by the ambition. It's coming and we can see it, and it's only going to get better. So I think that's what I think is holding us back. And I think that's why I feel a burden to succeed. Beyond my own personal ambition, I won't pretend like I'm not ambitious personally and don't have personal satisfaction with what we are building. When I think about Yemaachi, what scares me most about us failing, I'm not afraid of failing, but I'm driven to succeed because of what our success will mean. Our success, even the little success we've had so far, and hopefully the greater success we'll have going forward, is helping to unlock the imaginations of people I see at Legon, at Ashesi, young people who, for lack of a better word, look up to people like me. They are beginning to believe that they can do it too. And I think they have the ability to do it much better than what I'm doing. But my example will give somebody the confidence to just take that leap and say, you know what, if Bediako can do it, I can do it too, right? So that's what our success will mean. And so I think we can focus on the fact that there are not as many Patricks, but hey, there is Patrick, right? And since Patrick, now there's Academic City and all these other things coming up. He's here. So we have one. America has one Barack. It's not like typically you have one Winston Churchill. You have one Isaac Newton. You have one. You have generational individuals who come up. The question is, what do we do with our generational talents? What do we do with those beacons, those shooting stars? Do we hitch our wagon to them or do we throw stones at them and say they are too low? And I'm not putting myself in that, I'll be very careful not to put myself in that category. One day maybe I can.
Oh, you definitely are. You definitely are.
I don't think I've not earned it quite yet. But that is.
You're definitely on that road. We're hitching to your wagon and going with you.
But I think that's what we need to. So I would focus on the fact that we have some. Like Ghana is not a big country, and you have Awandare who started a center from nothing. You have Patrick Ewa. Before them, you have people like Frimpong Boateng who started the cardio center. Like we have Kwame Nkrumah, for goodness sake. I mean, we were the first to get independence. Ghana has a history. And let me put my father there. We have Kwame Bediako, right? We have a history of globally competitive excellence. Ghana seems to produce it. Even footballers, some playing for Ghana, some playing elsewhere.
I know, right?
Right? So
We find a way.
we find a way. So that's not our problem. The problem is, how does that begin to transform everything around us? Are they just on a pedestal and we say, oh, it was so great when they were here? Or do we see that growth? And I think that's where we need to begin to work, is
Couldn't agree more. And I love the fact that you embraced the seeming negativity of the question, because that's to help us unpack. And you're absolutely right that before people, it's hard for people to become what they cannot see. So that example of yourself, of a Patrick and so on, as a starting point, allows people to start to think, oh, wow, it looks like it's possible, right? But then that person who has to become it, it's a hard road. Let's make no mistake. But then you highlighted something else, which is the privilege of exposure. Yeah. Right. And that I'm glad you were willing to use the word privilege, because it is a privilege, but it's not a privilege in the sense of it makes people it should make people suddenly feel exclusive and elite and set apart. It's a privilege that you use to come and actually do something. And every single person example that you gave, including Kwame Nkrumah, right? Everybody focuses on he came from a village in Zima and Corfu, blah blah blah. But he had the privilege of exposure,
exactly,
to come back and challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think some of what we need to do, not every Ghanaian needs to leave Ghana to have the exposure, but I think every Ghanaian should benefit from what that exposure means, whether they get it through today, the information age, so they can get information, or by seeing the way someone else who has had that privilege actually does what they do. And the examples are numerous and extensive. I mean, Kwesi Twum came from abroad and decided that we could have media houses that actually gave voice to what goes on in Ghana. I mean, I'm sure people must have looked at him and thought, this guy, we are here, we are fine. He's coming to do radio station for what? Right? And it's more and more of that. Today, we assume that having a media house across Ghana is a no-brainer, is a norm. But actually, it took someone going, we will start this as a private individual. I'm not talking national, but as a private individual. So as we start to wrap up, let's talk a little bit more about Yemaachi and the work that you're doing in Africa and positioning it. So if we built a strong biotech ecosystem in Africa, because right now you've convinced us that biotech really has a role to play in our economy, in our development, in our prosperity. If we're successful, and I sure hope we are, what measurable shift would we see in healthcare and in enterprise if we gave ourselves a 10-year horizon and we had lots of people, they watched this, they saw this, they're like, right, that idea that I've been sitting on, I'm going to dig in. What should we expect to see in a decade?
I think, like as I said, at a very macro level, if we're able to harness biotech the way I hope we are able to, we will see double-digit GDP growths, like, across most of our countries. I mean, I think 25, something like, I think I think it's 15 to 20. I need to double check percentage of US GDP that is linked to R&D, right? It's staggering. I mean, Africa's GDP is somewhere around, I think, 2.8 to 3 trillion right now.
About 3 trillion.
About 3 trillion. So,
which is the valuation of Apple, by the way.
Exactly, right? One company. When you come to, you think about Novo Nordisk, about 2 years ago, Novo Nordisk single-handedly contributed to 2% GDP growth for Denmark. One company, right? Because they launched Ozempic, and everybody was popping Ozempic, and they were printing money. And I think their market cap hit like 700 billion. And, they're a Danish company. Denmark has like 5 million people.
Can we put that into perspective? 600 to 700 billion
Yes.
is a large chunk of Africa's GDP that we say is true. But if we bring it home to even like Ghana's GDP, it's forget the exact figure, but it's under 200 billion.
It's 100. It just crossed the 100 billion threshold.
Exactly. So just for everyone listening, one company 700 billion, our national GDP is 100 billion. These are the kinds of things that are at stake if we want to stop being poor or viewed as poor and truly prosper.
Absolutely. So I think when you think about it like that, one company, 700 billion, if that was a Ghanaian company, What does that mean about GDP, right? So that is a single company. Now, yes, it's a pretty old company. It's been around for, a long time, but we need to start somewhere. And so I think if we are able to build a truly Pan-African biotech ecosystem, we have the opportunity to be bigger and more globally relevant than any of these giants that we see because of what we are working with, right? It will take time. And of course, some of them will come and acquire some of us. And, that's fine too. The point is, Africa will now, there will be value that is coming here because investments will come. We will grow the investment slice. So it's not just be 2% of global venture capital money that comes to Africa. It may be 5, it may be 10 as we continue to grow. And that will then also impact on the day-to-day lives of people. We keep trying to solve healthcare by making healthcare cheaper. Why not give people more money? Right? I go to events and they talk about how, the average healthcare spend for an African per capita for an African country is, $20 or $40. And in the US, somewhere in Europe is $4,500. And so everybody's trying to squeeze healthcare costs into $40. Where to me, the obvious solution is make that $40 $400. Right?
Exactly.
Right. So stop trying to stop trying to have everything be so cost effective and force Africans to afford to get some basic level of healthcare for a very paltry sum. Why not grow the amount of money you have to spend on healthcare for people? But that happens when your economy grows and people have better jobs and more disposable income. So for me, it's when we think of economic transformation, I'm not an economist, but what I've learned is we need money to make this go. And we need to think about commerce. But historically, we focused in very few areas. And most of those are very low value add, very extractive. And oftentimes we don't get to set the price. So we don't set the price for our cocoa. We don't set the price for our gold, right? It's all commodity markets. But when you get into R&D and you get into knowledge creation, you get to set your price. And so I think Africa, as I said in the beginning, Africa's economic futures are tied to leveraging all the 1.4 billion brains we have into creating new knowledge that the world will salivate over. And when we can do that, then we begin to turn the global dynamics around. And there's more, there's more revenue here, there's more investment here. So biotech is obviously a part of the solution, but I think it's a very untapped part right now for the reasons I've already described. And so I think if we can, like I said, if we can do that, we will see significant GDP growth and it becomes a snowball because then people begin to take us seriously. We are training more people, fewer people will have to leave. And gradually, I think the situation on our continent will improve. And you just have to look at, countries that have done this. Singapore, I use an example, has done this to great effect. They decided to migrate away from just electronics to biotech. It was an intentional move government made. They've made some significant investments as a country, but they've reaped 10 to 100 times, maybe even 1,000 times greater benefits in 10, 15 years. Now, not a single biotech company of any repute does not have an office in Singapore. I mean, all the big pharma companies are there. All the big technology companies are working through Singapore. And like I said, it's a very small country. It's 4 million people. It's basically a single city. So if they can do that there, imagine what if we could do that on a continent as large and as diverse as Africa. The sky is the limit, literally. So I think that is what, in my opinion, that's what it would mean. And, Novo Nordisk and Denmark is maybe the best example I have. If a single company can single-handedly, go from zero, without Novo Nordisk, Denmark would have had zero growth. Because Novo Nordisk was so successful that year, Denmark was able to post 2.4% GDP growth. That's the math. So imagine if we had 5 Novo Nordisk, one in Accra, one in Nairobi, one in Lagos, across Africa.
I know the continent transforms, right?
Yeah.
Continent transforms. So I love the mention of our 1.4 or so billion people population, the vast majority of whom are young. So they're really minds and energy that we can harness. Do you think that as a continent we produce enough scientists? And I'm thinking really in the vein of Yemaachi and all that you're doing, are we producing enough scientists, even if you think about one of the stated missions being healthcare, drug discovery, cancer treatment, are we producing enough scientists to really help us achieve that?
It's a difficult one. I don't think we're quite producing enough. However, I think we focus so much over the last 10 to 15 years on training people without thinking of where they go that we're sort of chasing our tail. So
Mhm.
it's brain drain and we've not plugged the drain, and yet we're just trying to create a bigger tap.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
hesitate
Okay.
to focus on we need more people, because the truth is, if we could repatriate half the expatriate Africans around the world, we wouldn't need that many people. And many of these people are highly skilled, they're innovating and producing wonderful innovations outside of Africa. So I think while we do need to train, and we do, as you said, we have a young population that requires training, and we need to focus on education as an important pillar of our economic transformational plan, we also have to focus on creating the jobs that young people want to do. And in fact, jobs that
Mhm.
are exciting enough that some of our Africans who are in nice jobs in America or in Europe or in Asia will think of applying to. Because it's not just
Yeah.
about mass, when we think about job numbers, we focus on, factory jobs, typically, oftentimes lower skilled, you know, jobs. We need the high skill jobs. We need
Yeah.
the jobs that require extreme innovation. That's what's going to be attractive. No, to a young person who is ambitious, that's what they want. They want high paid jobs that allow them to have a comfortable life and go on vacation, have disposable income to do a few things with their family. That's what everybody dreams of. That's, what we call the American dream. Africans have that dream too. So saying we'll create jobs and you work in a factory doing something that's very repetitive is not attractive. So yes, there may be a need for some of those jobs, but I also don't think you can compete with China and India when it comes to that kind of manufacturing. They've mastered it,
Mhm.
and they are single countries. When we talk about the 1.4 billion, we always lump Africa together, forgetting that it's actually 54
Yeah.
countries. So it's like 30 million
Yeah.
Ghanaians, X 100 million Nigerians, and so on. So when you fragment it that way, it's not it's not like we have this,
So,
it's not equivalent to China or India, who have single countries with massive workforces. So Africa is going to have to be strategic, but I think that also allows us to focus on higher skilled areas where it's not just about numbers, but it's about the skills these people have. So I
mm,
think we do need to train more, but I think even more pressingly, we need to create jobs for people. And I would rather create the jobs and have a surplus of jobs and then train people to fill those jobs than to focus so much on training and have less, have a shortage of jobs, which mean many of these people are either frustrated or will leave. So I think we need to shift our focus to job creation as we continue to build our educational capacity. But job creation, I think, is an even more important thing to address. But the type of job we're trying to create is also very important. And I think that is where we require ambition. That Africa needs more than low paying factory jobs. We need highly skilled. We need to be thinking like Silicon Valley jobs or financial sector jobs and all of that. And let's let's build those kind of jobs, knowing that Africans can do those roles.
yeah, absolutely. So in closing, I want you to have a last word to the Yao, the you, the Yao, the Lucy, the Patrick, who the difference between them and some of us is they didn't have the same opportunities
Yeah.
or the same exposure, but they have an equal amount of intellectual capability and curiosity and hunger. It just hasn't been discovered yet, but they can feel it bubbling within them. You know who you are inside, even when opportunity doesn't come knocking. I'd like you to share your final word with such a person as to what would you tell them to think about, position, do any word of encouragement that you'd have for them as we build our prosperous continent.
I think the first thing I would say is your ambition is not something to be embarrassed about. You are one of a small number of people who has the ability to dream. And that is not a bad thing. So first of all, don't stop dreaming. No matter what your circumstances are, you have that dream, hold on to it. It is not something to be embarrassed about. Your family, other people may tell you, oh, you're dreaming too much. No, Africa needs people like you. So the first thing is don't be embarrassed about the ambition. But the second thing is work towards that ambition. Ambition is great, But a dream without action just remains a dream. And so you need to take concrete steps to advance towards that ambition. And those concrete steps will include adequate training, will include seeking out mentors, will include critically assessing your deficiencies and trying to either address them yourself or building a team around you to address those deficiencies. And then finally, never giving up. It sounds easy, but I'm yet to find anyone who has had true meaningful success without perseverance. So I think that's what our advice is. Don't complain about your circumstances without doing something about them. Don't be embarrassed by the ambition, but allow that ambition to fuel you towards trying to achieve it. But recognize that achieving it is going to require a lot of hard work and a lot of capacity from yourself that you may not already have. And so you're going to have to build. And so don't be too eager to take that leap without trying to build up the requisite skills and the networks to give you a good chance or a better chance of success. And then at some point, take the leap and don't stop fighting and don't stop grinding till you get there. And I believe for a large majority of people, that will end up in success. It may take longer than you think, as in my case. You may find it is much harder than you ever imagined. But if every day you wake up and you feel I've taken one step closer to that dream, and I would honestly rather not do anything else, then you're on the right path. Just keep putting one step in front of the other. And when you look back someday, you realize just how far you've come.
Awesome. Dr. Yaw Bediako, thank you so much for taking the time to unpack your journey in entrepreneurship, in scientific entrepreneurship and innovation. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lucy. Really appreciate the time as well.
Thank you for tuning in to The Bold New Normal. I hope this episode has inspired you to think boldly and take action towards creating the future you envision. If you found value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs a dose of boldness today. Until next time, take action to create your bold new normal.